will invite my facilitator for the day, Tunguna, to take us through and does the officiation of this program. Thank you so much. Over to you, Setu.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning. It's definitely afternoon. Like Uputsonaba has said, my name is Setu Ngona, and I will be facilitating today's very interesting session on the return of African artifacts from museums across the world. Today's program is going to be pretty simple. We'll be beginning with opening and welcoming remarks from Uputsimpiwa from Conrad. We'll have a beautiful piece of poetry from Sisilele Tu, or Black Poet Soul, before we begin with our speakers for the day. I'll begin by introducing each of them. We have Ausi Napo Mashiane, who is a multi-award winning playwright, producer, director, poet, cultural activist, translator, and performer on both the national and international stages. Born in Soweto, but grew up in Kwakwa and is currently based in Johannesburg. She holds a marketing management, speech and drama, and master's degree in creative writing, and is the founding member of Fiela Sister, or a spoken word collective. She's also an incredible theater maker, including plays such as My Bum is Genetic, Deal With It. I remember that Ausnapo from my young feminist times. The Fat Black Woman Sing, Kwezi, Say My Name, as well as My Vagina Was Not Buried With Him. She's the first Black woman to produce, write, and direct a play, a new song at the Market Theatre, or now the John Kani Theatre, and she held the position of Deputy Artistic Director at the South African State Theatre. She also sits on as an advisory board member for the Stockholm University of Arts and is the managing director of Village Gossip Productions. Okay, I hope Ausnapo will be able to share her social media tags in the chat for those who would want to connect with her further. We also have Upudwisile Shoma Mashululu, who is a writer, a Black poet, activist, social political commentator, founder and anchor of the Afrocentric channel Mudaba, and is involved in a number of initiatives such as the Black Power Front, Black Brothers United, and a number of others which are aimed at restoring the dignity of Black people. He also has a long history of working in the creative industries and is a soul and jazz aficionado. I would like to get some names from you after this. And he has a long-standing passion for development within the Black community. I'd like to welcome our two speakers warmly, with the hopes that we have an incredible discussion today. And without wasting any further time, I would ask Sisilele Tu to bless us with her poetry. Thank you.
Okay. Once vibrant and starry-eyed, Azania was known to be a maiden who lived on the hope that beat inside her golden chest. When her name comes up in conversations, I imagine her as a dark beauty whose skin's natural oils kept her aglow. Must be the reason they thought of her as magical and dreamy. It is said that she had a knack for the composition of the most melodious of songs as her special pastime. Claims that she was a witch could be strongly rooted in her mischievous habit of picking her choir members in the darkest hours of a whispering night, choosing who would sing which part just by listening to her choristers' breathing patterns as they slept. With beautiful melodies implanted in their dreams, the Azanian choir would wake up singing new songs in an amazingly perfect harmony. Taking no credit for her work, Azania would be pleased with just the knowledge that her songs would live endlessly in the memory of her people. Azania was a complicated girl, some simple-minded people would say, because they were too scared to look into her eyes and attempt to decipher the secrets of her silent smile. A woman of very few words, Azania was always dedicated to tending her garden, placing in each plant a special power to heal all the ailments of her people. Azania's garden had the most fertile soils, the perfect setting for the medicine cabinet of those times. She chose a few, but very special hands to assist in her healing work, taught them the ways of soul healing, far more precious than physical healing. Azania must have been truly wise beyond her years. But Azania is no longer who she used to be. Old, battered, and bruised, her eyes now of a long forgotten past, a time no one cares to remember. The trauma of her innocence being stolen calls for the amnesia. The memory of her helplessness as thieves penetrated her sacred parts, ruthlessly raping her glory into smithereens, is nothing special to remember. Today, the thieves own the fertile soil with mystical powers. They have succeeded in demonizing the work of the soul healers, and them too walk around shamefully with their eyes cast down, giving themselves up to the doubt, totally forgetting all the knowledge Azania tattooed inside their hearts. Azania's people, they have surrendered to the thieves, shrugging their shoulders, thinking if you can't beat them, join them. So now Azania is dying a slow death. Her choir no longer sings in perfect harmony. None of the choristers seem to remember the whispered songs. Her skin now ashy, her beauty is fading. The stars that once shone from her eyes replaced with her gaping wounds. She is no longer the magic they once saw. This story is written by a little girl who never met Azania in her former glory. But through stories that have been told, she is haunted by the idea of a gold heart beating inside of Azania's chest. She's writing this as a whispered plea to the chorister in you that lives. She's begging, do not let Azania die. Sing a song, and I promise you that heart will find its rhythm again. Just one song sung the Azanian way. Thank you.
Oh, incredibly powerful message and an incredibly powerful way to begin what I had said just before we began, an incredibly deep conversation on Africa's stolen artifacts and the manner in which we as Africans address restoring our heritage. Before I pass on to our speakers, perhaps I can lay the ground for this discussion by introducing the fact that it comes at an incredible time. After the arrest and the arrest and charging of one Mwazulu, Diabanza, who is a DRC native who was arrested in France for walking into the Denalals Museum and taking an artifact from Benin and attempting to walk out. And the gentleman has a very strong history in the restorative movement. So he even began the Multicultural Front Against Pillaging. And beginning in France, his aims are to move on to Spain, Germany, Portugal, the Netherlands, and other British museums to get this back. An incredibly interesting conversation, like I said, perfect timing. But before we go into that any further, I will introduce our first speaker. For those who have just joined us, I will introduce our first speaker as Vuisile, who is a writer, as I've said, and a Black Power activist, a socio-political commentator, as well as a founder and anchor of an Afrocentric channel called Mudaba. He's also involved in a number of initiatives such as Black Power, the Black Brothers United, aimed at restoring the dignity of Black people. He's also active within the creative industries. But Vuisile, it's incredible to have you here, and I'm sure many of us are looking forward to hearing your views on this rather sensitive topic. Over to you.
Enkosi kakhulu, my sister.
All right. Sorry, but we still.
Yes.
Sorry, just a quick one. I think we've missed one item, opening and welcoming by Simpiwe Zondani on behalf of Kenred.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Sorry, Simpiwe. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's all good. It's all right. Okay. Shall I just dive in? Okay. Okay. A good morning to everyone present. Botani, Fuyamora, Avsheni, hello and welcome to CANRAD's second webinar in this year's Africa Week, right? We as CANRAD, thank you for taking the time out of your day and busy lives to join us and take in this year's Africa Week programming. We would like to welcome our wonderful speakers, Napo Mashiane, Udvuisile Mshudulu. We would also like to thank and welcome our facilitator, Setu Nguna, from the Center for Sustainable and Integrated Rural Development at KwaZulu-Natal University. We welcome and thank today's poet, Leletu Maambehla. We would like to extend a warm welcome to the youth watching from Utenaig Science and Technology Center. Now, today's installment promises to be quite provocative and thought-provoking as an offering. Our speakers will take a deep dive into the highly contentious topic of repatriating Africa's stolen artifacts currently housed in many European and some Arab museums, right? From my end, I think it's prudent to contextualize this discussion with a bit of history and a bit of just revisiting some seminal texts, right? When I think of this discussion, Mudimbe's Invention of Africa comes to mind, particularly the part where he traces the etymology of the words colonialism and colonization, identifying their Latin root colere, which means to cultivate or design, right? He sees the colonial project as one of organization and arrangement. He argues that both colonists and colonizers are driven by different aims, right? The former seeks settlement, whereas the latter seeks to dominate. Both tend to organize and transform the figure of the non-European, and in this case, the African, into a European contract, right? To a large extent, his assertion is correct. You need only look at the Western literary canon to find evidence of this, right? One of the most notable examples of this designing of others can be seen in the concluding chapter of Chinua Achebe's tour de force of a novel, Things Fall Apart, where the commissioner muses about writing about the village that he's just decimated, affording it only a paragraph, but he's already thought about the subject or the title that he's going to give it, the pacification of the tribes of the Lower Niger. Here, Achebe represents and responds to the constructions and meta-narratives regarding Africa by colonists, missionaries, and colonizers through the literary medium and anthropological texts, right? Through stories, language, these European subjects become architects of what is outside of their own world, and they see the continent and its inhabitants to be this heart of darkness filled with childlike beings without history, culture, religion, or civilization. Besides literature and text, cartography is also another method in which Europeans organize Africa into knowable and conquerable object and power. It is through this power of the colonial imaginary and its execution through text and knowledge production that Africa is domesticized and pacified, right? This perspective for me, particularly this idea of Africa being a place without culture, religion, civilization, simply put, contrasts sharply with this idea or the reality that many of the works that were taken from the continent during this great scramble for Africa and the many lootings that happened, that many of these works are part of exhibitions and retrospectives where their brilliance is celebrated by people of all walks of life, but without benefit from the people who created them. Just a few years ago, there were a lot of conversations, they were mediatized, where they were talking about repatriating African art. And some countries agreed to do so, but only as indefinite loans. So they would give them back, but they would still retain ownership of the works that they'd never created and that they'd come by through dubious means, right? There was a somewhat sympathetic French position advanced by Macron, but it was also very condescending, right? Belgium had a much more culturally imperialist view. In one television broadcast, there were two art critics that were invited, and they spoke about the topic of repatriating African art. One dismissed the whole affair, saying that it wasn't art until Europe deemed it art. The other spoke about Africa as a place reproducing all of these Afro-pessimistic perspectives, as a place without enough resources to take care of them, and that they would be looted given enough time. So within this broad and complex context, today's discussion happens. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Utsimpiwe. Very clear introduction into the topic, which relays not only the seriousness of it, but also the conflicting perspectives which exist within it, whether valid or not. As I tried to do before, Butwisile, we are looking forward to hearing your views on the topic.
Thank you, Kakulu, Siswam, Sisetunguna. And also, I think I welcome Inchaelelo Ka Butsimpiwe Kakulu. It really set the tone for the input that I had envisaged for today. To start, I really appreciate the introduction that you gave, Siswam Sisetunguna, as our facilitator. And I also would like to acknowledge my fellow panelist, Ausnapo Mashiane, who's my sister that I respect and revere very much, particularly on the subject of, finding ourselves through the creative realm, So thank you for joining us, Ausnapo. And I also would like to thank the Nelson Mandela University, specifically CANRAD, for organizing this very important Africa Week lecture series, and also for inviting us to be part of it and thinking that we are worthy of, adding value to the important array of subjects that you have been handling throughout the week. Today's topic, to go right into it, today's topic is Africa's stolen artifacts and the restoration of our heritage. This is without doubt one of the most important issues that we as Africans should be preoccupied with. To set the context for this conversation, I wish to make several interrelated points as a prelude. And then after that, I will go into much detail, into the how I understand and even want to project the subject. The first, interrelated point I want to make is that the looting and pillaging of our natural, artistic, spiritual, and human resources should be viewed in the context of the over 1,000-year history of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism in Africa. And secondly, when we talk about such monumental atrocities as the Trans-Sahara and the transatlantic slave trade, which saw the forceful removal of over 12 million Africans from the continent of their abode, we must also understand that the looting of our people in Africa also included the looting of what they call artifacts, and I'm going to problematize that label. And thirdly, in the context of today, the looting of Africa's natural and human-made resources continues, and this is primarily because of the phenomenon that we refer to as neo-colonialism. Now, to try and make sense of today's topic, I will briefly reflect on the following subjects. Firstly, the importance of self-definition. And then secondly, I shall look at reflecting on the role of the Arabs and the Europeans in the disruption, the destruction, and the plundering of African ecosystems and our civilizational splendor. And thirdly, I will also look at the theft and destruction of African sacred works, which I call sacred works, but African artifacts, and the desecration of sacred African systems and practices. The fourth subject that I will look at is the reflection on the restoration of our heritage, which is linked to the main topic today. And then lastly, as a fifth point or a fifth subject, I will look at the implications of the continued retention of sacred African works in European institutions. Now, where I want to start is with the importance of the act of self-definition. As Africans, our definition of any existential problem and our reaction to it should be underpinned by an authentically African and Afrocentric approach. After the looting and the pillaging of Africa, the Arabs and the Europeans had the audacity to define what our problems are as Africans, and further want to prescribe what the solutions to these problems should be. And this is something we must detest. They steal our sacred works, they call them artifacts, and they then further want to say to us that they are protecting them from theft and damage when they are the thieves of these artworks. And then later on, then they say, we Africans must prove that we are capable of managing that which we have produced, we have the capacity to manage these artifacts. This is nothing else but the nauseating stench of white arrogance, which we must challenge. And our generation of Africans shouldn't allow the same people who stripped us of our humanity to define our problems and even prescribes what the solutions to such problems should be. For far too long, we as Africans have allowed our race enemies to define us, to name our possessions, our places, and even our property, and even go as far as claiming to have discovered us. It is this cognitive arrogance that has and continues to make Europeans believe that they have sole proprietorship over our bodies and everything else that is ours. We must countenance this cognitive assault, and instead we must rage, we must engage in a cognitive rebellion against this cognitive assault. For this reason, calling these artifacts, calling these spiritual works artifacts is to reduce their importance and their value. And therefore, I want to argue that we must call them sacred spiritual works instead of just calling them artifacts. And I believe that this will locate them better in our quest for self-definition. I now want to look at the role of the Arabs and the Europeans in disrupting and destroying and plundering African ecosystems and our civilizational splendor, because we have seen how attractive they found this. It is illogical to speak of theft of our artworks or our artifacts and not name who the thieves are. And in this case, I want to name the thieves. The thieves are the Arabs and the Europeans in the main. As stated in the beginning, for centuries, there has been a consistent and a systemic plunder of Africa's civilizational splendor by primarily the Arabs and the Europeans. For instance, today, there is a monumental tragedy that is unfolding in Kemet, which is now misnamed Egypt. We watch with sadness how the Arabs, who have now taken over Kemet, regularly invade, they raid, and they desecrate the tombs of our ancestors. They invade the tombs of our deities of antiquity, turn them upside down, take whatever they deem necessary in order for them to create a global commercialized spectacle. And out of our sacred heritage, what they do is that they do this under the guise of a pseudoscience called Egyptology. One of the results of the desecration of our heritage A classical example is the global exhibition of our warrior king, Tutankhamun. You know, I'm sure many of you have seen the exhibition of Tutankhamun and how the desecration of the tomb, the Saqqara tomb, has been facilitated by the Arabs. The Arabs who now rule Egypt have laid full claim over our ancient Kemetic heritage and continue to make millions, if not billions, out of it. We as Africans never intended to monetize the sacred elements of our heritage because we understood the difference between price and value, you know. And the point that Uputi Simpu was raising in the beginning, that these things would have never been art had they not decided that they are art. We had a much deeper spiritual value attached to them other than just calling them art. The practice of extracting profits from the cultural wealth of a people is something that was invented by our enslavers. Now, if you for a moment pause and just imagine if we walked as Africans into the Vatican today and started opening the tombs of all the popes that are buried in there, what do you think the reaction of the European world would be? Or better yet, what would happen if our descendants were to desecrate the graves of all the royal thieves that are buried in England, in Belgium, and all other colonial states, and start exhibiting them across the world as the architects and beneficiaries of slavery and colonialism? What do you think would be the reaction of the white world in this instance, you know? And again, what would happen if the Germans had kept the skulls of all the Jews that they have killed during the Holocaust and refused to return these to their descendants? There would be absolute outrage, you know, and global condemnation for these heinous acts. And I can guarantee you that there would also be serious militaristic consequences for such an act. The question then is, why is there no outrage against the desecration of our cultural and spiritual heritage as Africans? And I would argue that it is because that in the eyes of the white world, we as Africans are nothing and represent nothingness. All this must inform our fight for restoration of our stolen heritage. It is our understanding that these injustices that have been visited upon us must strengthen our resolve to have our heritage and our dignity restored by any means necessary, just as it would be the case for other race groups. The meaning we attach to these objects is different to the way that our race enemies see and perceive them, you know. And the practice of displaying sacred works is alien to us as Africans. You know, remember what they did to Ugogo, Usara Bartman, and Umkhulu Otabenga, both of whom were displayed in human zoos for the amusement of the Europeans, whether those Europeans were in Europe or in America. And these are things that are alien to us and to our ways of doing things. Fourthly, I would like to reflect on the theft and the destruction of African artifacts and the desecration of sacred African systems and practices. For a long time, I have been trying to find something that the Europeans in particular have not stolen from us as Africans. If you think about it, they stole our civilization, they stole our ideas, they stole our so-called artifacts, which I called our sacred spiritual works. They stole our land, and they stole even us as Africans. You know, this is very ironic if you consider that these are supposed to be people who despise us, who hate us, who don't even want to see us, you know, and who see us as nothingness. Very ironic. There is an abundance of museums and many other cultural institutions in Europe's most celebrated cities, such as Berlin, London, Paris, Munich, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and all of the others that I haven't mentioned, that are overflowing with heritage objects that were stolen, and others were not just stolen, they were forcibly taken from various parts of the continent. These works are kept in the storerooms and exhibition halls for the pleasure of the Europeans. Most Africans, particularly the future generations and the current younger generations, will die without even having seen the very works that they purport are on display for the benefit of future generations. To give you an idea of the size of this loot that the Europeans have in their hands, at least 1.5, it is reported that at least 1.5 million African sacred works are in private and public institutions in Germany alone, only Germany. This should give you a sense of how widespread this problem is. If you consider the British were more brazen in their theft and many other European nations than many other European nations, one can only imagine what the volume of the loot is in Britain, from the continent of Africa. The example that stands out, in my view, in terms of the damage to African sacred systems, in terms of our own ecosystems, was the destruction of Benin. The ecosystem of Benin was disrupted, and for a long time, Benin has been the center for production of bronze sacred works that are placed everywhere across Europe and American cultural institutions currently. And to trace the genesis of this loot in Benin and the destruction of Benin, we must remember that in 1897, the British embarked on what they called the British Punitive Expedition, which resulted in a massacre of Africans, the destruction of their property in Benin, and the mass looting of their sacred works. These works found their way to various museums, including the British museums, the British Museum in particular. I know that these works are in the British Museum because I saw them there for personally, I saw them for myself. And the awe-inspiring, and we Africans sometimes like to glorify the aesthetic architecture of European museums in particular, as is the case with many other institutions that we glorify. This aesthetic architecture of these museums conceals the fact that in their construction is the blood and the bones of our ancestors that were used as building blocks to give rise to those institutions, And I mean, there's an argument that once these artifacts are repatriated to the continent, they would leave those institutions empty, which proves the point that, these institutions are standing on the blood and the bones of our ancestors. All of this is connected to what I said earlier, the over 1,000 years of Arab and European invasion of Africa. And these are but just a fraction of the examples I want to refer to, to demonstrate the destruction and the desecration of African ecosystems, either in Kemet, in Kush, in Nubia, in Mudaba, in Mali, and in many other African kingdoms. Now, to turn our attention to the restoration of our heritage, I wish to start where I would say, to fully understand the process of restoring our heritage, we need to understand what constitutes our heritage. And our heritage, in my view, comprises the totality of our land, our waters, our African skies, the volume of our natural resources, those under the ground, those above the ground, and those that are stolen and stored in European, American, and Eastern vaults. And further, our heritage also comprises the products of our intellectual and our spiritual property, which were stolen and forcibly taken and are now kept and displayed in various institutions in the imperialist and colonizers' institutions. This, in my view, is the totality of what should constitute our heritage, at least in our imagination. Our forebears left for us, the current and future descendants of Africa, all the land, all the wealth, and the dignity of our inheritance. Our liberation and its productive existence is therefore intrinsically linked to the return of our sacred works, because we shall be freeing the body parts and the souls of our warrior ancestors from the prisons of our race enemies. And these museums are nothing else but prisons. In order to have the capacity to assert our authority as Africans, we must fight to call Africa our own. It is through the authentic and full ownership of our land and its produce, the full control of our mind, bodies, and spirits, and all their produce, that we will be able to earn the right to call our souls our own, as Ubabu Sobukwe once asserted. This is ultimately how we will restore our heritage. Once we have attained true liberation, and true liberation I define as the capacity to defend ourselves and our property, to feed ourselves, and to educate ourselves amongst others, then only shall we have the might to compel any Arab and European who holds a sacred African item in their possession to return it to us, the rightful owners. Our heritage is our dignity, and our dignity is our heritage, and we must be uncompromising when it comes to the restoration and protection thereof. And to turn now to the implications of the continued, which is the last subject I'm going to deal with, the implications and the continued retention of sacred African works in European institutions. One of the primary intentions of those who have dominion over us as Africans is to erase that which will inspire our self-determination, that which will provide clues to our warriorship and the warriorship of Africans that came before us, and also to perpetuate the lie and the distortion of our historical wonder as Africans, you know. This they do to continue their domination and to justify their repugnant acts against us. Even if one was to look at purely, you know, purely at a creative and artistic perspective, if you were to look at these artworks from that perspective, one would find that the inspiration that the current and future artists would draw from these works could have a revolutionary impact on our cultural and socio-political worldview. The implication, therefore, is that today's Africans are denied the inspiration that can unleash an avalanche of revolutionary ideas in their artistic realm. And at a more fundamental level, Prince Kum Andumbe III, an African elder and historian from Cameroon, captures more eloquently the implications of the continued retention of African sacred works in foreign museums when he said, "These ethnological museums are like prisons. They are prisons. Our souls were stolen and now they are locked up in them," close quote. This is a more fundamental implication for the continued retention of our sacred works in these institutions of our enslavers and colonizers. The souls, the bodies, and the intellectual wealth of our ancestors remain imprisoned in the ethnological museums of those who murdered and raped and sold our ancestors. The vile act of mutilating African bodies and taking body parts of Africans to the various parts of Europe is no different from the act of stealing and forcefully taking artifacts taking our artifacts to the various museums in Europe. Even the arguments that are used, you know, to keep the body parts are the same arguments that are advanced to keep the artifacts in those museums, you know, because we know the body parts of many of our warriors are kept in these museums, in these colonizers' cities. The same British Museum, for example, that houses the Benin bronzes also has Egyptian mummies, which shows that in the eyes of our colonizers and slavers, there is no difference between the physical body and the object. But also, if we can also argue that these are both an extension of the soul of the creator, you know, the body and the objects of their intellectual property are an extension of their soul. As Africans, we infuse our creation with our spirit, you know. That's how we come to the conclusion that these are sacred spiritual works instead of just artifacts. Therefore, The British Museum, like many others, are prisons of our soul, of the souls of our ancestors. We continue to look for our ancestors. You know, siyaphahla, sizamu connect with our ancestors in the spiritual realm. And sometimes we struggle to connect with many of them because they remain imprisoned in the dungeons of Europe. In 1835, for example, our warrior king, Ukumkani Uyintsaka Khauta, Zanzolo, was beheaded and mutilated, and his head remains in the possession of the British. So it is the case also with many other kings like Khosi Mpolokeng Janki, for example. How can we then trust that the people who refuse to repatriate the skulls and the body parts of our warrior kings will suddenly find it prudent to return the sacred works they stole from the continent? And I argue that lama gqwirha kasoze ayibuyise into athwele ngayo. To refuse to return our sacred stolen works is to justify the perpetuation of the original crime of slavery, colonial invasion, genocide, looting, and plunder. This is the same approach that is used to justify the theft of land in the criminal settler colonies such as South Africa. It is such justification that gives rise to the question, for example, what are the natives going to do with the land? You know, which means what are Black people going to do once they get ownership of the land? And the same question goes to what are the Africans going to do with the artifacts once the Europeans and the Arabs cede ownership and control of these to them? The answer is simple. It is none of their business what we do with our land and our artifacts. They are the thieves, and they are entitled to no decency from our side. This is the beginning and the end of the story. We must not entertain them. The arguments regarding the capacity to store, conserve, and facilitate access through exhibition of these artifacts don't arise, and neither should they even be a point of departure. To comply with the cognitive arrogance of the Europeans is not just to succumb to coloniality, but also to insult our own intellect and even to spurt on the graves of our warrior kings who fought in defense of our land and our artifacts. Besides, these European museums that are holding the loot are in themselves incapable to conserve and restore and manage these works. You know, we know that in Germany, for example, in the storerooms, you know, all of those works are continuing to degenerate because there's no conservation capacity to care for them. So who's lying then? Who's fooling who to say that we will not be able to care for these stolen artworks? And now, the interpretation of our reality is highly steeped in coloniality, because the very tools that we use to analyze our lived experience are colonial in nature. And therefore, it is for that reason that I argue we must not call these artifacts, we must call them sacred spiritual works. To conclude, facilitator, in conclusion, if we as Africans lived in a world that considered African life as sacred, this presentation, for example, that I and my sister Sisnabo are making today would form the basis of an indictment to our enslavers. For example, the royal thief Chief Elizabeth and her British museums would be indicted. The German Chancellor of Theft and her 5 Continents Museum, amongst others, would be indicted. All the commanders in thief of France, Belgium, the United Snakes of America, and every other state, museum, corporate, or family that has illegal possession of our sacred artworks should be and would be indicted. But we know that to call these people, we need to call these people to account for their criminal and murderous activity on the African continent and force them to repatriate our sacred works and to pay reparations for the illicit benefit derived from their continued retention. This would be the case if we lived in a world that values Black life. But because we live in an anti-Black world, and in the words of Nesta Marley, I wish to say, we Africans must fight because we find it necessary. We know we shall win because we are confident in the victory of good over evil. Amako.
I think you've said quite a bit on this, initially problematizing even the idea of calling these artifacts as opposed to sacred spiritual works, which are an extension of the soul, and diving deep into the manner in which both these Arab and Europeans have, in essence, positioned themselves as custodians of world history, and thereby limited the historic agency of Africans in general. I like how you closed off by saying that their return, the return of these sacred spiritual works, could in itself create the rapture of many other frameworks of dominance that exist and create sort of a revolutionary redefining of the role of the African within the world. So thank you very much for that. I could say much more, but I don't want to waste too much of people's time. In the group chat, many people are speaking to agreeing with you in terms of how the patronizing nature of the engagement on these sacred spiritual works, as well as the dishonesty, I guess, in how the conversation is defined. But I think at the end of our after Sis Ausunapo has presented her side, I think we'll delve into the question and answer sessions a bit more. I would hope that people continue to ask questions and also give comments on your view on what I thought was an incredibly interesting and insightful presentation on the topic at hand. Next up would be Ausunapo. Are you with us?
I'm here. I've been listening.
All right, that's great. I think for the purposes of those who may have just joined us, I'll go through your profile again, just so people understand who you are, because you're a big deal. I hope you know that. And the work you have done within the country so far. Ausunapo is a multi-award-winning playwright, producer, director, poet, cultural activist, translator, and an acclaimed performer on both international and national stages. She is originally born in Soweto, who grew up in Kwakwa, and now stays in Johannesburg. She holds a marketing and management, speech and drama, and master's degree in creative writing. She's also a founding member of Fiela Sister, a spoken word collective. And from that, she moved on to become one of South Africa's leading theatre makers. Making My Bum is genetic, deal with it, the fact Black women sing, Kwezi say my name, as well as my vagina was not buried with him. She's also the first Black woman to produce, write, and direct a play at now the John Kani Theatre. And between 2017 and 18, she held the position of Deputy Artistic Director at the Southern African State Theatre. She sits on an advisory board under Performing Arts at Stockholm University of the Arts, and is the Managing Director of Village Gossip Productions, a theatre company, where she directs, researches, lectures, performs, and documents Black women narratives. Ausunapo, Uput Vasila has said much, but I believe you come from a different perspective, would hope, which would further enrich the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Setu, for
It's 12 hours.
Oh, by the way, my laptop, because of teaching always every hour, reminds me that time might be up. But thank you so much for an amazing introduction. I'm so honored. And very, 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 in a very, I know I was saying it to my brother, Mr. Mshidulo, and my fellow panelists, like, hey, it's sometimes better to perform, because you get on stage, there's a script that you follow, you know where the beginning, the middle, and end goes, and then you bow, and then you are off. When I was invited to come and present, it took a lot. It took a lot. I was like, they should have just asked me to do a play or to write a poem. But I'm so honored so much to be here. And to just share bits and pieces and parts of myself. I'm so grateful to the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University for creating this kind of platforms that I think they're very robust, provocative, inspiring, and just also extending the African narrative further. But more so, I think it's very, very important. And now I speak as a theater, practitioner, that it's very important that this kind of platforms exist even within the digital space, so that we can reclaim parts of ourselves, but also take control of the kind of narratives that we want to be out there, that have our names, our faces, I've got a slide that I would like to share, because I'm a visual person, and I know that if I don't share the slide, I'll end up going over time and thinking it's a theater production, and there's going to be an applause at the end. With that said, I'm going to share, and also just to say that I'm going to be speaking a lot from my own personal view and experience. That when the topic was said, and I was processing how am I going to approach, or what would I want to address, for me it just I battled, and I'm happy that my fellow panelists, even from Wednesday, this notion of artifacts, how we keep dismantling it and saying that we are decolonizing it, that it's not artifacts, and I like what Ndate Nchudule has said, that it's spiritual works, but I want to even take it further. For me, is that it's our church. That's the only church some of us are born with, so it's part of our DNA. And with regards within my field, we don't talk about objects, we talk about, the forms of storytelling. And for me, things that I feel personally have been stolen or not documented and archived within, the global stages, global literature, and within our narratives is orators. I always say that beyond the masks, beyond, the mineral resources, our voices as Africans have also been stolen. And one can, go further in terms of what that looks. But as somebody comes from theater, my point of entry is the fact that how I grew up in a sector that said that, theater, started in Athens, in Greece, and because it was documented as such, Africans never had their own theater. So who are we to say that theater is part of our DNA? Who are we to say that we have theater existing within our communities? Who are we to say that there's a storyteller in our every corner of, culture and traditions? So I wanted to really talk about orators, and then with the approach of talking about theatrics, poetics, and narratives. As most of, us probably know how, orators, are oral, literature. Most of our stories are not documented throughout history. Most of us grew up hearing stories. We grew up hearing myths. We grew up with folk drama that was not formalized. We grew up with songs, praise songs, work songs that have somehow been transcended and journeyed across different generations throughout our history. And also going back a bit in terms of the myths, how the whole notion of we didn't have a god, we have gods, our ancestors versus, the other gods that that have been forced upon us. The notion of black magic, the notion of seers, of traditional healers, how that, that was wiped off the history of African people. But funny enough, when they start doing films and they start doing theater productions abroad, there's something they find magical about what they said to us we cannot be, or we cannot own, and it's owned within their stories. And later on, I'll also tap into one of those examples, which is Harry Potter. But beyond the songs, you know, the fairy tales, how most of us, we grew up in a society and education system that has always said that, you know, you need to be a Cinderella, you need to be a Snow White, you know, you need to be the Beast and the Beautiful, you know, all these fairy tales, as if as Africans, we never had our own folk tales and fairy tales. And crazy enough, most of us became theater practitioners because we grew up hearing stories from our grandmothers. And these are women who never saw a day in a classroom, but were able to document the essence of our identity as Batwabantu, you know, the existence of our various, you know, rituals and cultures, you know, across time. As a result, you know, that becomes your classroom through storytelling and stories that we most heard. Even in a contemporary setting, I do know that there's always a storyteller in every township corner, in every office corner, in every academic space, and within our friends, there's always that friend who just emulates and is able just to transcend, you know, and wear different kind of like arms of characters. So how sad it is that we are told that we don't have stories, yet we are walking, living bookshelves and living libraries, as I like referring to us. Also, you know, the whole notion of spoken word, you know, how in terms of our own historians who are poets, and I'm happy that we opened this session with poetry. Again, it wouldn't have done justice to have this kind of a session and not have that voice of wisdom, that voice that reminds us why we are all gathered here, which I think is very beautiful. There's also a beautiful twist of things that have not been acknowledged within our history, and I think more than them being stolen, it's them being wiped off. So again, that's my view and my approach, that, you know, a lot of our traditional games are rooted in riddles and proverbs and idioms. But also things like, you know, the rain-making games that most of us in villages, you know, we grew up with these games that were so embedded within our theatrics. You know, there was always somebody performing. There was always the beginning on how, you know, one game starts and how it goes and how it finishes. But also with things like the rain-making games, how we know that at the end results, or the goal will be for rain to come, and how that also ties in with our ritual, you know, rites of passages, initiation school, and so forth. Again, indigenous knowledge system that is not acknowledged across the globe when it is being shared and by us Africans, but when the Europeans and other, you know, thieves, when they share these stories, they are more valid than when we the ones who live and breathe and have experienced it, you know, claim it. I would like also just to go into my focus in this particular section. I also want to talk broadly about Black women voices, narratives, you know, that also will involve some of the things of our multiple languages, that is the sense of us, again, connecting us to orators, connecting us to oral history that has been wiped off and often not acknowledged. The essence of our choreo poems, how, again, you know, theater is in our DNA. You can't separate us from, you know, the face, the artifacts, from the voice. Our rituals, our spirituality, our traditions, things that we inherit, as I said there, songs and our songs and dances, but also the acknowledgement that our culture has throughout history evolved and keeps on changing to the day. But also within this beauty of rituals, of traditions, of things that are inherited, we as Africans as well, you know, our voices are very political. Our voices are very, you know, speak against or instead of a particular subject. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And I think also this somehow ties in with the notion that feminism started in, you know, only European women, in my case, with my experience, are the only ones who are who sort of feel like they have entitlement to the whole notion of feminism, as if our mothers, our aunts, our grandmothers were never feminists, but also because we never use labels and titles so much, somewhere in the loose, in translation, we're not seen as women who can speak for themselves, who can take a stand, who can lead a family, who can actually lead and actually even a whole village. So that the politics of Black women voices are also intertwined with, body politics, the politics of our existence as Black people, tie in with performance of the resistance. Most of us are familiar with protest theater, from how we gain this kind of freedom that we have. But all these things for me, in terms of the rising issues, is undocumented archives of our people. It's the whole element of ownership, which I think all the panelists have touched on. It's how do we also reclaim our history and history, the validation of Black women existence and voices, and on all these labels that we need to understand in a broader way and take back their existence in a much more bigger scale. But also furthermore, when you talk about African artifacts, you're thinking about exploitation that also ties in with everything I've said. You're thinking about how Black women bodies, in my case, and within my studies, how I know that we've always been exhibited across history in all the parts of the world. So then how do we localize? How do we create a location for our theatrics, for our poetics, and for our narratives? I'm very obsessed with Black women narratives, and it's funny. I don't know. I'm going to use the word funny, but it's kind of heavy that this is the year of declared the centenary of Charlotte Maxeke, and how within all our sharings that we forget that Charlotte Maxeke, then Manye became Charlotte Manye. Maxeke that we know now was also a chorister, and actually one of the things that are not so highly documented, unless you really go into the archives, is the fact that she was part of the first musical theater production made out of 16 choristers who traveled from Africa to Europe, and later on that's how she got her scholarship, for those who know, and ending up in the US. But for me, it's as a Black woman theater maker, it's very important that when we look at some of our female icons, that we should not wipe away from their history, the essence of their artistic and creative voice. Through that choir, that's how she found her voice. That's how she reclaim her existence as this pioneer kind of woman. But I can even go further and talk about Grotowa, the first female interpreter. There's a film made, with regards to her, an amazing, beautiful film that gives an outline. And I think that's how some of us are, when you reclaim this story. But, there's other stories that I feel like have not been fully told within our spectrum. The story of Mantadisi, the story of Mantsopa, the prophetess who actually predicted that white butterflies will come across the sea to devour our lands. Mantsopa, again, the first woman to also predict that we all will be driving cars. People are going to be, between the clouds sitting as a result, the aeroplane. Just the lack of acknowledgement of some of these narratives within our history allows us to be stolen from us and to be retold by others. The story of Mujaji, the Rain Queen. I mean, I can go on. Mkabaika Jama, Anungause, and all the other women. The most famous story that has come and that actually has also launched me in terms of my voice in theater was the story of Sarki Bagman, who of course was, exhibited post her becoming a human zoo in the UK and some parts of Europe, but how her body parts ended up being in a French museum. And only in 2000, our first democratic elected president brought, her body parts back, but we still have two other Khoisan women with no names that are still sitting in a French, somewhere in a French embassy, a French museum. I think I deal a lot with embassies. That's why I'm like French embassy. So beyond these undocumented narratives, and it will probably answer some of the questions on how we claim these stories and we archive these stories as Africans and take pride in these stories. Also stands the whole notion of, African makeup, costume, mask, and hairstyle. Something that I feel like within my industry has not highly been looked at in terms of the aesthetics of what makes a performer, but also how even our makeup within the kind of performances and stories that we tell is both a spiritual expression, but also expression of beauty, and also expression of storytelling. By mere look at us as Africans across the continent, you can tell who is a traditional healer. You can tell if somebody is putting on a mask to become a monster, like in this case. You can tell if somebody is going through a rite of passage. You can tell so much by just the way we even do face, scarring or masking. And I think these are some of the narratives that I feel within our oral traditions have not transcended to being fully published by Africans. Most of this stuff, you find them across other libraries in other parts of the world, and little here. And if also it's even in South Africa, which I find it very disturbing, there's always a white face behind, the explanation. So this oral literature information, gets collected and gets published, but those who the original owners of this indigenous knowledge system are not acknowledged in those books. And I think for me, it's one of the things that really gives me nightmares. And again, the question of the different types of masks, I think that we should really have touched on some of the masks. I know other panelists have touched on some of the artifacts, but how our masks are also ritual and spiritual things that were taken from us. It's almost like somebody, your God, or your gods, or your ancestors, and how some of these artifacts, when we travel across the world, they are there, but there's no name in terms of who made it and the story behind why they made it. Most of us, we see this kind of mask, as beautifully hanging on people's walls across, even locally, and in some fancy hotels, but I find it very unsettling that we don't have a proper, pronunciation and location of where that mask was found. What does it mean? Have we taken an aspect of somebody's shrine and turn it into an artifact, in a nutshell? And like I said before, theater is our church. Some of us, we breathe, live, and this is, we do what we do because it's how we connect to our ancestors, but also that's the basics and the origins of African theater history. And here I'm just showing a different landscape of how, as Africans, way before we were colonized, post-colonization, how we were always, our art, our expressions, our narratives were always connected to a higher being, because we understood that we stand on shoulders of giants, but also how the very same churches were turned, and that's how also was an entry point for a lot of colonists in this country, when they told us that we don't have a God, or our gods don't matter, and we're given a different kind of gods. And I can go on and on. We know when we see our cultural activities, when we see cultural dances and performances, there's just something that transcends us and puts us into a trance. Some of us, we don't communicate and express ourselves through words or through voice, but the sound of the drum, the music, the beat, from our feet, how we connect with nature, how we communicate with the sky, how we communicate with our essence and sense of humanity, makes out this undocumented, orators and oral traditions that should not be taken. But also how we, in many parts of the way, we have all, like when you look at this picture, we've also, infuse our cultures with that of the colonizers. And I suppose it becomes another different arguments that then who has ownership of certain cultural practices and art forms that we have, and that gets exported and imported across. And just quickly, I just want to show that how I think, and I believe that theater has been one of the forms beyond protest, has been one of the strong forms to document. Setu did say that one of the first shows that I did was my Burmese Genetic Deal With It, and it really focused on just the body structure and the body politics of Black women in general, and how the media, the digital space, the contemporary kind of like media space does not take acknowledge of African beauty and African existence, especially when it comes to Black women. And I compare that with what happened to Sadki Bagman, but also look at what is happening currently, and one of the biggest cases that Castas Mania is battling or challenging the whole notion of. It seems like we cannot have ownership of our bodies as Black women or as Black bodies. Somebody will always have a view, an opinion, an expression when it comes to our existence, and how I feel like our theater, our film industry, our stages need to showcase all these elements, and perhaps that is a contribution in terms of reclaiming our bigger being and existence. And some of the shows that I have done, how they still connect to this day to our view on gender-based violence, on femicide, on how women also in terms of protests, protesting on the streets, from total shutdown to #MeToo, and how then do we reclaim our bodies through a movement that is infused within singing, within spoken word, within expressions. And one of the things I wanted to say is that also how often when we talk about Sakti Bagman, we never give acknowledgement on how she also influenced fashion, the envy that British European women had on her body structure, how later on it revolutionized the Elizabethan Bassets, how your waist is tight and everything else is very, very protruding. So I think in essence for me, she's a pioneer who was sacrificed, who was exploited, but somebody also who really influenced fashion, and hence a lot of us, we also feel like her legacy should also include the fact that she also contributed to other forms or other layers of being a Black woman within the beauty industry. I'm gonna try to go, we can talk again about hair, we can talk about, again, we remember the story of Pretoria, Zuleka Patel, how she took a stand, and now she's got a book out. Again, for me, I acknowledge the younger generation for going out and really, pinning out and talking and challenging, but also documenting our kind of identity and our forms of beauty. Again, you cannot separate our hair, especially Black women's hair, to spirituality, to forms of expression. And I can go on and on and on, and with regards to that. Trying to go to the next slide quickly. I think, am I still connected?
Yes, you are still connected.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, okay. But I just wanted to, I can go on, but I wanted also just to touch base and talk about, it's a pity, I think this technology is, I just wanted to talk briefly about also how in the contemporary setting that things like, things like when you look at the Lion King, when you look at the King Kong, when you look at all amazing South African, productions that have been more acknowledged in an international setting before they were acknowledged by us Africans. And I think sometimes we also as African narrators and storytellers and artists, or creatives, we need to take acknowledgement that we pretty much also, especially in the current forms, have we need to take accountability that we have so much to do with allowing some of our spiritual works, to be celebrated abroad as opposed to by us. And it takes accountability on our part to say that if Lion King can take and almost steal, In the Jungle, the Mighty Jungle, the Lion Sleeps Tonight song that was written by Solomon Linda. How do we then, how do we reclaim such particular things that have been stolen that makes lots and lots of millions of money for Disney World? And I remember having this conversation that I remember working at Lion King earlier on of my career in New York, and how the case of, the Solomon Linda's family or descendants were fighting Disney. And I'm happy that eventually they won the case. But I can go on, I can make current contemporary references on, how Beyonce always constantly looks to Africa for, dance, for music, for sound, for everything else, and pays huge amounts of money. I know a couple of years ago, he took a group from Zimbabwe to go and teach him Sipanzula. And, and then all of a sudden it became such a popular dance within, her music video. But even within Black is King, how she came here and had almost seeing the need to collaborate with a lot of our artists in a broad spectrum. I mean, it's a thin line, and it's a question that maybe most of us we need to explore, even with when we're talking about a restoration, location of African works and African voices. Where do you place it within the contemporary setting? Who's got a right to what? Because we know that everything has started in Africa. You look at the elements of hip hop. When I was in New York again, they were telling me how hip hop started in the Bronx and everything else. And I was like, no, it did not start in the Bronx. It was important. It was taken through slavery. When you look at gumboots and the symbolism or just the identity between gumboots and tap dance. So within my work as a theater maker, I'm always obsessed with making sure that Africa is remembered and seen and heard, within when we start defining all these elements of performance art, across the world. When I enter a space, I'm very clear that we have our own theater, we have our own theatrics, we have our own poetics, we have our own stories that we need, to reclaim. When somebody's telling me about Cinderella and Snow White, I'm like, well, we have Tselane Ledimu, we do have Silatsatsi, we do have Mushanyana Sankatana Lohodumodumo, and I can go on. I think within every ethnic group in South Africa, there's always that story that is a reflection of what is popular within the European setting, and somehow we've been made to feel like, that those stories, we don't have them, or they were never ours, including the whole elements. And when you look at aesthetics of Harry Potter, the woman traveled to Lesotho, sat among our grandmothers who were telling her stories, and made extensive research and recordings about, zombies, ditokolosi and all these things, and how she took it because she has resources and turned it into this mystic, groundbreaking kind of book. I mean, I can make so many, references. All of us have watched Black Panther, and how the Amazons, became such a significant figure within that. But within that, again, it's a question of location, representation. Do we see ourselves in that? Do we have ownership in that? The kind of language that is being used. Is the world enough of a stage for us to not just reclaim, but to challenge and to start writing, articles and broad presentations about, what the truth is. And for me, that goes beyond just, minimizing our knowledge system to artifacts. Even our voices, our songs, our dance, our poetry forms part of spiritual works that have been stolen and that we constantly have to return back home and ground it home, and better off make, money out of it, as opposed to all those museums across the world. Yeah, in a nutshell, that's just what I want to say. My slide, it's quite extensive and long, but I think this is just to show an entry point, especially within the academia, that there needs to be more voices that sound, that looks, that speaks like us, and the kind of voices that needs to go beyond saying it's our artifacts that were stolen. It's a sense and existence and the soul and spirits of Africans that constantly is stolen and is being stolen, sometimes by people like us, sometimes by those who are different from us in all spectrum of race, financial resources and opportunities, and financial, economic benefits. I hope I made sense. I think I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Osnapo. I think that was a fascinating journey into sort of connecting the topic of artifacts, or as Butwisila calls them, sacred spiritual works from the past, and joining them into contemporary times and giving them life in what is happening around us today. So I think that was a very interesting discussion. And I think within what you had said, the idea of these sacred works that are currently being produced as making us living libraries who are able to advance our own narratives in the world and develop spaces in which we are sort of the protagonists of our stories, and able to share that. As Ubudwisile had also mentioned, the idea of price versus value, and how, because our cultures are in the main orientated around oral literature, how that has seemed to, create the idea that they are of less value, while simultaneously finding, these images that you were sharing, coming from Alamy and other libraries, which have taken these image rights of what are sometimes extremely sacred events, and publicizing them in order to make means. So the idea of how repatriation, archiving, and ownership are joined in together is very powerful. I'm also glad you mentioned the idea of a Black woman narratives, because, as you know, within most of, like you mentioned, most of our interactions with art forms, be it weaving, be it storytelling, be it things of the nature, stem from one or other matriarchal character or persona within our lives. An example of that is Umama Mahlangu, currently, who's doing incredible work and placing things on the map. I'm not quite sure about how that works in terms of rights and things like that, but I think the idea of localizing our own contributions to our stories is an incredible one. So I think joining all of these together, there have been some questions in the chat zone. I won't try to I'll throw them out to both of you, and whoever catches it. In the meantime, we'll whoever finds the most interest in it, while awaiting more questions within the chat box. Tandogazi has written two questions here, but I think I'll park her second question until near the end of the session. She asks about how we've focused our understanding of these conquests and thieving in terms of the European interaction. But what about the Arab perspective? Why does it seem like that has been silenced, and what can we do about that in a continent that seems to be more and more Arabized in its orientation? I'll leave that to any of you to respond to.
Okay, I saw the question by Osiswe Tutandokazi. And I think where we must start is to locate the problem. One, our dispossession, was a violent conquest. I think that's where we must start. And before there was European invasion of the continent and the enslavement of Africans by the Europeans, the Arabs had already, for centuries before that, been the instigators of the slave trade in the continent. And I would argue that the Arabs even, coordinated the most brutal forms of slavery in the African continent. And that resulted in, the movement of Africans out of the continent, the castration of African men who were sold into various parts of Arab states and even outside the Arab states into Europe and America, and even the using of African women, you know, in the most brutal ways, and sometimes as sex slaves. And that's why there's been the argument that there is some form of African heritage in some of the Palestinians that exist today. It's because it dates back to that brutalization of African women by the Arabs. Now that continued with the Europeans, and we know how that has manifested. So the question we must then ask is that the theft of our people, our resources, our land is a violent action and a violent conquest against us. So what should our response be? We can't respond in hugs and kisses to people that are violating us. It means, therefore, we have to reciprocate, and we must think of ways in which we will defend ourselves, we will defend our property, and prevent and set the tone to prevent a future recurrence of such, you know, repugnant and heinous act against the Africans. So, and we must continue to also shine the spotlight on the role of the Arab, and not just ignore that, particularly when we pay, you know, solidarity with the Palestinians. That solidarity should not be devoid of the contextual understanding of our history, that Arabs have and continue to violate us, that there is continuance of slavery by Arabs in the continent. If you see what is happening in Libya, if you look at what is happening to Black people in Yemen, there is a continuation of the violation of Black people by the Arabs. And I think we must hold the Arabs to account at the same time as pledging our solidarity with what is happening to the Palestinians. Thank you, sis.
Thank you very much, Budvoisile. I think it contextualizes what has truly been taking place. Now, Ausnapo, you had mentioned within your presentation the role of the academic creation or the development of academic narratives which can be shared. So Osimpiwa within our chat zone was asking, what is the role of universities, and I guess in this case academics, in conscientizing people on the necessity for the repatriation firstly, but also in ensuring that their value is understood. The value of these works is understood across the board.
I think it was what my fellow brother Sompi said on Wednesday about how as Africans we need to start, you know, creating and building our own universities. History can attest that we've always been about education. You know, as a Black woman, every time we talk about elements of sexuality and sensuality within the context of Black women bodies, I always refer to initiation schools of women that has been wiped off the system, and that, you know, used to be the palette for teaching us not just about the essence of our existence, but our claim names or our identity and spirituality, but also our being, our bodies, and how we understand that. And that also goes for a lot of initiation schools for, you know, Basotho men and Basotho women. And for me, it's I would like, you know, and I would want to be part of a generation that proudly and profoundly, you know, contributes in the education system that stands on its own, that is not apologetic about Africa and Africans. And I think there's a lot of indigenous knowledge and wisdom that, you know, that is out there that is about to weigh off, you know, and die with this old living bookshelves that are among our communities that we need to bring within academic space. And as somebody who's between academic space and somebody who's a practitioner, you know, you cannot go to somebody else's house and impose your rules. You can try to influence, but it's their house. They decided how many rooms they want, what kind of a roof they want, how the door is, the driveway and everything else. So I feel like we need to go to spaces where we build our own house. It's like forcing yourself around a table. Build your own table. Don't try to squeeze yourself around the table and they tell you bring a chair and then you squeeze, but you know that you are there as a poster face. I think we need to get to spaces and intellect, trust our intellect enough to open our own universities and also create essence of sisterhood and brotherhood and them and their hood, right? That allows us to be where we know we matter, and then collectively as a force, as an army, take a strong stand for what Africa is and should be, especially going forward. Otherwise, history is going to judge this generation harshly, and history is going to judge this generation harshly.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I think, like I said, I was leaving Thandokazi's question for right till the end in order before I move on to the closing remarks by Oputsimpiwa. But before I go into a question, today's discussion really it brought about a certain quote by Utada Umangaliso Sobukwe, which reads, "The wheel of progress revolves relentlessly, and the nations of the world take their turn at the field glass of destiny. Africa will not retreat, Africa will not compromise, Africa will not relent, Africa will not equivocate, and she will be heard. Remember Africa." I'll move this to the question by Uthandokazi before I allow Oputsimpiwa to, and also give you a chance to make your closing remarks. Sister Thandokazi asked, because the nature of the work is so draining, how do you continue to feed yourself as you go? But Priscilla, the things you're talking about, the slavery, the theft, it's quite angering actually over time. So how does one continue? And I think this is a message that will go across to even those who are listening to us today, who have joined us. How does one go across maintaining the resolve? Not only the resolve, but the hope and effort required to keep doing this, to keep the work going, doing the work. Yeah, I'll let any of you.
Okay. No. Thank you, my sister. The one of the things that I talked about in my presentation was the deliberate act of self-definition. We Africans must take control of how we define the problem and how we diagnose the problem, and in diagnosing the problem, we must go further and identifying our enemy. We must not talk in generic terms of very obscure terms about what our problem is and who is the source of our problem, And our problem is that we're an invaded people, we're a dominated people whose land and possessions have been taken and controlled by others, and those are weaponized against us. And as a result, it's creating divisions amongst us, it's creating deprivation amongst us, and it's creating all sorts of desperation that are leading to secondary forms of violence, because the original act against us is a violent one, So that is the source of the problem. Now, who is the instigator? The instigator is the Arab and the European. We have to identify them. Now, we can't, when we want to find solutions to our problem, be led or even involve the very person who is the source of our problem. So we must engage in an act of self-definition, self-diagnosis, and even prescribe what the solutions to our problem should be. Now, secondly, we must engage in this act of deciding whether we want to dismantle the system that is entrapping us, enslaving us, and depriving us, or if we want to improve our position in it, And this also applies to the question about the universities, whether we want to be part of these universities whose intention for their their existence was part of the project of colonization in the form of epistemic violence against us as the natives. So, or do we want to improve our position in these universities? So that's the engagement we must have once we have diagnosed our problem. And my solution is simple, that we have to dismantle, disrupt, and even destroy the system that is entrapping us. And we must be able to improve our capacity. And one of the things I talked about when I said what I envision as our liberation is the capacity to defend ourselves and our property, the capacity to feed ourselves, the capacity to educate ourselves, which means we must develop our military might. We must have ownership of our land so that we can feed ourselves on our own terms. And we must be able to educate our children, which means we must build our own institutions that will advance our ideals in the way that we envision our future, but not as prescribed by our enslavers and our colonizers. Thank you, sis.
I think for me in closing, and just also to answer some of the question, and I want to also pose a challenge on us as Africans. Yes, the thieves are Europeans and Arabs, but also many of us have allowed and created pathways, accessibility for this essence of our being to be easily stolen. And I think we need to go back to the source. Africa needs to go back to its own. We need to understand our connection to the land, to the air, to the fire, to the sky. We need to, holistically look at just the sense of our identity, our spirituality, and acknowledge that, before us, there were others right here. And once we're very clear and unapologetic about that, it will be hard for us to commit self-suicide. So we will not walk into spaces, self-muting, self-censoring, apologizing. When an African walks into a room, into a space, needs to do so with all and everyone that, they are part of. And for me, it's our connection to our ancestors. Our connection, when we talk about ancestors, it's language, it's our names, it's our poetics, it's our being, it's the essence of the land, of everything that comes with it. And also the whole essence of when we talk about Ubuntu, right? When you see the other, the same way you see yourself. And then we can start dealing with all that was taken and was stolen by the Europeans and the Arab, but also we'll be able to acknowledge the kind of challenges that, I always say when African Americans talk about Black Lives Matter, it's racially layered. In South Africa, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, you're talking about elements of, sexism, of femicide, of, right? And we will not be classified the kingdom of femicide when we are being, if we were not being killed by those who look and sound like us. So for me, this is just an entryway. And I think like somewhere along the line through everything that was stolen from us, we lost the sense of, human connection and human, identity, and self-love, loving the skin, and loving the other the way you love yourself. So for me, the premise is, and it's a blessing and a curse, this subject that we're talking about, but we need to go back to the source and like what the question was saying, that how does one do, you go back to the source, you ground yourself, you remember why you are part of the land and part of everything that makes, Mother Earth what it is, and that's Africa, and then how that speaks and connects to your heart and soul.
Thank you. I'd first like to thank you both for an incredible conversation that I hope would continue in multiple other spaces, and not only continue in the form of conversation, but also continue in the form of active engagement in the necessary works required. So I'd like to thank both of you very much for that. I will now hand over to Ubutsimpiwe. If I'm not sure, I hope I'm not messing this up. No, I will now hand over to Mrs. Leletu, or Poetic Soul, to bless us with another piece of poetry before we call it a day. I'm excited about it. Sis Leletu, do you mind blessing us?
Yeah. Yeah. Awakening in each morning to the slap of your morning sun, if only to live in the awareness that I am still one with you, still one of yours. No shame in my name, that I wear with pride. It is the strength of my connection to you, Mother of all nations, cradle of humankind, bosom of life that knows not of thirst. In your space, there is never disease, for you are all that heals, and every corner of you is all that knows. We call unto your mountains for guidance, and your waters of wisdom never dry out. We look to you, compare ourselves to you, mirror ourselves in you, but your haunting beauty, it never fades. Ubuhle bakho abupheli, ubulumko bakho abusoze buyeke. Africa, you are the evergreen queen. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
I want to do the finger snaps. Finger snaps. All right. I guess in this way, I think there's an echo. Okay. I guess in this way, I now first thank everyone for participating. Firstly, Ausnabo for an incredible and intellectually challenging presentation. Budwisile, what I think a call to arms from your presentation in addressing things as they are. I think not beating around the bush, which was very much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who attended the session, and a special word of thank you to Marco in the back end for helping us with technical things, and Butsonwabo for making it all possible, and Canrad. Thank you very much.
Siyabulela sethu. Siyabulela ma-Afrika makwande. Tsamaku baba.
Tsamaku nto zakuthi.
Listen,
Thank you, my sister Osnapo.
Thank you so much, everyone.
You really blessed my soul today.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Leletu. Thank you, Sonabo. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
This Leletu siyabulela.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.